In this lesson, we're going to be discussing the ins and outs of preferences and defaults. In InDesign, it's so easy to change defaults that you can actually do it by accident. Well, we're going to be talking about that in just a few minutes, but first, let's talk about the rules of thumb for defaults. If I don't have any documents open and I change anything in a panel, let me just go to my swatches panel, just open that up, and I'm going to change the fill to cyan blue. Well, I've just changed my defaults. Let me get my swatches panel out of the way by clicking the double arrows. And to show you what I'm talking about, I'm going to go in my welcome screen to create new document, and I'm just going to click OK. Well, if I don't have my welcome screen open, I can always go to File, New Document, and just click OK. And remember, I changed my default color to a cyan fill. If I go to my rectangle tool and just click and drag, you're going to see that all of the rectangles that I click and drag out are filled with cyan. Well, how do I change this back to my default swatches in this particular document? Well, what I could do is just deselect all objects by going to my selection tool and just clicking off of all objects, so nothing is selected. With no objects selected, if I change anything, I'm changing the defaults for this particular document. Well, changing the swatches is actually really easy. I'm just going to click on this little icon underneath the fill and stroke. And you can see the little note that pops up says default fill and stroke, and in parentheses it says D. Well, I can either click on this icon or just press my D key on my keyboard to get back to my default swatches. And now, if I go to my rectangle tool and click and drag, you can see my swatches are actually back to the defaults, and I no longer have a cyan fill. It's back to no fill and a black stroke. Okay, but I just changed the preferences right now, my defaults for this particular document. But if I close this document, I'm just going to click the little X and hit Don't Save. You can see that I'm back to the cyan blue fill. So how do I change this particular default for all future documents? All I got to do is click on that icon for default fill and stroke again, and it's going to be back to the defaults I want for all future documents. Okay, let's talk for just a couple of minutes about default preferences. Now, on a Mac, you can see there is an extra menu that does not exist on a PC. It's called the Application menu. And if I click down on the InDesign menu, you can see that that's where preferences are. And also, if I wanted to quit InDesign, it's under the Application menu. On a PC, preferences are under the Edit menu down towards the bottom. And if I wanted to quit the application, I would go under the File menu to quit. But let's go into Preferences. Remember, on a Mac, it's under the Application menu, Preferences, General. On a PC, it's under the Edit menu, Preferences, General. And the defaults in InDesign for preferences are actually really good. And it's very unlikely that you'll need to change most of them. But why would you change them if they're so good? Well, one reason is changing a particular preference may be better for the way you work. Change it. It's a good thing for the way you work. It'll make you more efficient. Another reason you may want to change preferences is to solve a particular problem. Let's say I'm working on a particular layout and there's a problem in this layout, and the best way to solve that problem is to temporarily change my preferences. And then when I solve the problem, I can change the preferences back. Great way to work. Let me give you some examples of this. One of the things you may want to change is under units and increments. And you can see that I've actually changed these preferences already. For horizontal and vertical units, it says inches. By default, it's not. It's actually picas, for both horizontal and vertical. So I may want to change this to inches. If I'm working here in the United States, chances are that's what I would want to do. But if I'm working in some other country, I may want to choose some other units of measure, such as centimeters. And whatever you change it to, just make sure you do it for both horizontal and vertical. Let me give you another example of when I may want to change preferences. I'm going to go to Guides and Pasteboard. And you can see that smart guides are actually using a color called grid green. Well, let's say I'm working in a document that happens to have a green background. Well, I may not be able to see my smart guides. So I may want to change my smart guides to some other color that will be easier to see, like let's say brick red. And then when I'm done working with this document, I can change it back to grid green if I want. Another thing that I may want to change, I'm going to go under Display Performance. And I've actually changed this particular preference here for something called Typical View, which is the way you see what's going on in your layout. And by default, for vector graphics, it's actually using something called Proxy View. And because of the kind of work that I do, I'm doing mostly advertising graphics. And when I'm bringing in vector graphics out of Illustrator, it's usually a logo or a simple chart, and not something like a full-blown illustration with lots of effects and really complicated graphics that if I went up to high resolution, it may take longer to display on my screen. But because my vector graphics are usually so simple, I drag it all the way up to high resolution to make placing my logos and charts a lot easier. Another thing that has to do with preferences, if I go to clipboard handling, when pasting text and tables from other applications, it will paste that text as text only. It's not going to include any styles that may exist. And because in the way I work, I get a lot of my changes from clients and editors in an email. And I can just copy their changes, go back into InDesign, make a selection, and paste the change. And the changed text will actually pick up the style that I'm pasting into in InDesign. Well, that's really a nice thing. It's a great way to work. So I'm not going to change it. But if you made any changes that you really want to keep, just click OK. And those preferences will be changed until you change them again. So that's about it for preferences, but we will be discussing more about preferences in upcoming lessons.